The aircraft lifted off from New York's JFK airport just as twilight melted into night. From the windows, the city glittered below, 1,000 golden veins stretching out from Manhattan's heart until they disappeared into darkness. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into their seats, the routine of flying so familiar it felt almost ordinary. Some already drifted into sleep, their heads tilted back, mouths slightly open. Others flicked through in-flight entertainment, headphones, wrapped over ears, immersing themselves in movies or music to pass the long Atlantic crossing. Flight attendants moved gracefully between rows, offering smiles, drinks, and pillows. Row 10 sat in that sweet spot between the bustle of economy and the quiet comfort of business class. It was neither crowded nor empty, just comfortably in. Between, in the window seat of row 10, rested a woman whose presence seemed unremarkable at first glance. Her head leaned gently against the glass, eyes closed, lips slightly parted as sleep claimed her. She wore a worn leather jacket over a simple t-shirt, faded jeans, and sneakers that had clearly seen better days. Her carry-on was tucked neatly. Beneath the seat in front of her, scuffed but organized, like the kind of bag that had traveled through more airports than anyone cared to count. To anyone who looked her way, she was just another tired passenger, one among many, anonymous in the hush of the cabin. But beneath that ordinary surface lay a past that few could have imagined. She had once flown fighter jets. Years earlier, her life had been adrenaline, missions, tight cockpits, and roaring engines. She had felt the gut punch of G-forces and the tense stillness of combat silence before the storm. She had trained for split-second decisions that decided life and death. But that was another chapter one she had closed deliberately. Now she lived quietly, working as an aerospace engineer, her hands on blueprints and designs rather than on controls and triggers. Flying commercial as a passenger was, in some strange way, her most difficult adjustment. For once, she wasn't in command. But tonight, as the Boeing 777 cut its path through the stratosphere, she allowed herself to relax. Her body, usually restless, gave in to the rhythm of the engine's hum. She shifted slightly in her seat, curling into the blanket the flight attendant had offered earlier. A few rows behind her, a toddler fussed until his mother soothed him with soft whispers. Somewhere up ahead, a man chuckled at a comedy flick. The air smelled faintly of reheated meals and coffee. It was all so ordinary, so comfortingly routine. The woman dreamed lightly, not of battles or cockpits, but of open skies. Her subconscious wandered to sunsets over oceans, clouds rolling like cotton beneath her, and the feeling of control, the way her hands once molded the very path of a machine through the air. Those days seemed distant now, almost as if they belonged to someone else. She had no intention of revisiting them. Passengers around her paid her no mind. A businessman in the aisle seat beside her scrolled through spreadsheets on his laptop, muttering quietly as if rehearsing for a meeting. Across the row, a young couple shared earbuds. Their heads leaned close, whispering and laughing. A grandmother in the row ahead knitted slowly, the steady click of needles almost blending with the drone of the engines. It was a slice of humanity suspended above the ocean, every soul bound together for the long night crossing. The cabin lights dimmed. The soft glow of reading lamps replaced them, giving the space a hushed, almost dreamlike atmosphere. Flight. Attendants disappeared behind curtains, leaving passengers in a bubble of semi-darkness. Outside, stars stretched across the velvet black sky, brighter than they ever appeared on land. The moon cast silver streaks over the wings, highlighting their sleek lines as the aircraft surged eastward. In row 10, the woman shifted again, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. Her breathing evened out as sleep deepened. Her body knew how to rest lightly, never fully surrendering, always poised for a call that might never come. Even in civilian life, that instinct never left her. But tonight, wrapped in the cocoon of ordinary travel, she felt almost free from it. Hours passed. The cabin remained calm, a rare oasis of peace 30,000 feet in the air. The engines roared steadily, an almost comforting sound that lulled the nervous and reassured the seasoned. The passengers trusted the unseen hands at the controls, never imagining those hands might falter. For them, flying was just another chapter in their lives, a trip to reunite with family, a step in a career, a holiday getaway, or a return home. For most, the journey was simply a bridge between two destinations. But destiny has a way of intruding on the ordinary. The woman stirred in her sleep, unaware of the shadows gathering in the cockpit. She shifted her jacket tighter around her shoulders, her body instinctively bracing against the slight bump of turbulence. It was a small jolt, the kind that passengers hardly noticed anymore. The businessman sighed, clicking through slides. The couple giggled, their laughter muffled. The toddler whimpered, but quickly calmed. Everything seemed fine. Yet fate had already begun writing a different script for this flight. Behind the reinforced cockpit door, something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. The co-pilot had collapsed, his body unresponsive, despite the frantic efforts of a flight attendant who had rushed in to help. The captain, his voice tight with worry, had radioed for medical assistance. But this wasn't a minor illness. The man who should have been his partner at the controls was gone, leaving him to shoulder the immense responsibility alone. And while most of the passengers slumbered in ignorance, the weight of the crisis grew heavier by the minute. Still, the woman in row 10 slept, unaware that she would soon be called, unaware that her past, the one she had buried beneath layers of civilian life, was about to surge back into her present. The hum of the engines carried her deeper into dreams, where clouds drifted and horizons stretched endlessly. She had no idea that soon she would hear words that would yank her awake and demand the impossible. Any combat pilots on board? And when those words came, her life and the lives of everyone around her would never be the same again. The flight had settled into the steady rhythm of long-haul travel. Hours passed in quiet monotony. The lights remained dimmed, leaving the cabin bathed in a soft amber glow from scattered reading lamps. Outside, the world was a sea of endless darkness, punctuated only by distant stars and the faint curve of the moon. The engines purred with relentless consistency, like the steady heartbeat of some great metal beast carrying its precious cargo through the sky. For the passengers, time blurred. Some slept, cocooned in blankets and dreams. Others shifted uncomfortably, checking the progress map on their screens every few minutes, impatient for the miles to pass. A few lingered in the aisles, stretching, legs murmuring politely as they shuffled back to their seats. In row 10, the woman slept on, her head still tipped against the cool glass. She had drifted into a dream so light it hovered just above consciousness, the kind of rest where every sound registered faintly. The businessman beside her had finally closed his laptop, though his fingers twitched as if still scrolling through invisible spreadsheets. Across the aisle, the young couple had surrendered to sleep too, their hands intertwined between seats. All seemed tranquil. Then the sound came. The cabin intercom crackled. A small, harmless noise at first, so common that most passengers didn't even stir. But then came the voice. It wasn't the routine, polished tone of a captain announcing cruising altitude or arrival times. This voice was tight, threaded with urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain began, his words slower than usual, his breathing audibly strained. "We have a situation that requires immediate assistance." Heads lifted, eyes blinked open. Conversations halted mid-sentence. A low ripple of curiosity spread through the cabin. Passengers exchanged confused glances, waiting for the usual reassurance that everything was under control. But reassurance never came. The captain's voice grew sharper. "If there are any trained combat pilots on board, please make yourself known to the crew right away." The words hung in the air like static, shocking in their strangeness. 4. A moment's silence gripped the cabin. No one knew how to react. A request for a doctor? That would have been understandable, almost expected on a long-haul flight. But a combat pilot? The phrase itself carried an ominous weight, conjuring images of war zones, emergencies, and danger. Gasps scattered through the rows. A child asked his mother what the captain meant, his small voice trembling. The mother hushed him quickly, her own eyes wide with fear. Two men sitting near the emergency exit exchanged uncertain shrugs, muttering under their breath. An elderly woman clutched her rosary beads, whispering a prayer. Row 10 stirred. The woman's eyes blinked open, disoriented for a moment, as she tried to process the voice cutting through her half-dreams. She sat upright slowly, her instincts tightening like a coiled spring. That word combat echoed in her chest. It wasn't the kind of word you ever expected to hear at 35,000 feet on a commercial flight. She turned her head slightly, listening intently as if the captain might repeat himself. Around her, passengers buzzed with nervous speculation. What did he say? Did he say combat? Why would they need a pilot? Don't they already have two up there? Something must be wrong. The businessman beside her frowned deeply. His brows knitted as he muttered, "This doesn't sound good at all." Flight attendants appeared from behind the curtain, their usual composed smiles now replaced with hurried expressions. They whispered among themselves, scanning the rows, eyes darting as if searching for someone. Their clipped steps betrayed urgency, despite their attempts to remain calm. One of them bent down to reassure a frightened child, but her voice trembled ever so slightly, giving away her own unease. The cabin's atmosphere shifted palpably. A few minutes ago, it had been serene, even dull. Now, it bristled with tension. The passengers leaned forward, waiting for something more, some explanation that never came. All that remained was the echo of the captain's plea, replaying in their minds. Any combat pilots on board? The woman in row 10 exhaled slowly, her jaw tightening. Memories surged unbidden airfields at dawn, mission briefings, the smell of jet fuel, the steady thrum of engines before takeoff. She hadn't been in uniform for years, but the identity had never truly left her. She knew the voice of urgency when she heard it. She knew what it meant when a leader reached beyond the normal for help. This wasn't a drill, nor was it a miscommunication. Something was terribly wrong. Still, she stayed quiet. Her heart hammered as she considered her options. Standing up, revealing her past, it meant more than volunteering. It meant stepping into responsibility again. It meant exposing herself to the scrutiny of strangers, to questions she had carefully avoided since leaving service. Most of all, it meant facing the very thing she had tried to leave behind. The sky is a battlefield, where choices were measured in lives. She glanced down at her hands resting on her lap. They looked ordinary enough nails, trimmed short, faint scars from years of work. But she could still feel the phantom grip of a control stick, still recall the vibration of a machine at full throttle. The past lingered in muscle memory, ready to rise if she called on it. The intercom clicked again, startling her. This time it was a flight attendant's voice, steadier but no less urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you have experience as a military or combat pilot, please make yourself known immediately. Please press your call button or alert the nearest crew member." A shiver ran down the length of the cabin. The words left no room for misinterpretation. This wasn't a mistake or an exaggeration. The crew was desperate. Passengers began scanning each other, as if expecting someone to suddenly stand and declare themselves. A man in a polo shirt raised his hand briefly, only to retract it with a nervous laugh when he admitted he'd only flown small recreational planes. Another passenger muttered bitterly, "What, are we in a movie now?" His sarcasm didn't mask the fear in his eyes. The woman remained still, her chest rising and falling in controlled breaths. She could feel the moment pressing down on her, a heavy silence waiting for anyone to break it. She knew deep in her bones that silence would not last. And yet no one moved. Every second stretched long, drawn tight with tension. The hum of the engines, once comforting, now sounded like a countdown. The woman's pulse drummed in her ears as she wrestled with herself, to reveal or not to reveal, to rise or remain a shadow. Her moment had not come, not yet, but it was close. She could feel it, like the shift in air pressure before a storm breaks. In row 10, she sat upright, fully awake now, her eyes scanning the cabin just as sharply as the flight attendants. She didn't know what awaited her beyond the cockpit door. She only knew one thing. The captain's plea had not been for nothing. Soon, someone would have to answer. The cockpit was a place of precision and order until the collapse shattered it. The co-pilot had been fine only moments earlier, his voice calm as he reported altitude and adjusted dials with practiced ease. Then, without warning, his face drained of color. His hand slipped clumsily from the throttle. He gasped once, as if trying to speak, and then slumped sideways in his seat. The captain reacted instantly. "Mike," he barked, shaking his shoulder. No response. The co-pilot's chest rose shallowly, then faltered. His eyes rolled back, unfocused and unseeing. Panic threatened to claw its way in, but years of training held the captain steady. His voice snapped over the intercom to the cabin crew. Medical emergency in the cockpit now. Within seconds, the reinforced door buzzed open, and 2 flight attendants rushed in. They pulled the co-pilot from his seat, laying him awkwardly on the cramped cockpit floor. Oxygen mask, pulse check, chest compressions, everything was tried. In frantic succession, the confined space echoed with clipped instructions and the desperate hiss of emergency equipment. But it was clear the co-pilot wasn't coming back. The captain gripped the controls harder, his knuckles whitening. He was alone now, flying a massive Boeing 777 over the Atlantic Ocean with more than 200 souls behind him. It wasn't impossible. He was trained for such contingencies, but the reality pressed heavily on him. He could already feel fatigue setting in, the weight of responsibility crushing his focus. Hours of flying still lay ahead, and the ocean below left no margin for error. He steadied his breathing, speaking low into the radio. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Flight 248, requesting immediate medical and operational support. My first officer is incapacitated. I am the sole pilot remaining." The reply from air traffic control crackled back, professional but laced with alarm. "Flight 248, roger. We are alerting emergency services. Can you continue flight solo?" "I'll try," the captain muttered, though even as he said it, doubt crept in. Flying solo wasn't the problem. It was the exhaustion. Hours alone at the controls, turbulence, the complexity of descent and landing. A single mistake could doom them all. And so, with a reluctant breath, he made the call that would ripple through the cabin, the request for any combat pilots. It was a long shot, a desperate plea, but better a long shot than none at all. Back in the cabin, the ripple of unease had become a wave. Passengers could sense that something more than turbulence was wrong. They had seen the flight attendants rushing forward, their faces pale and tight. They had heard the unusual request over the intercom, and though they couldn't see the cockpit, their imaginations filled in the blanks. Murmurs spread like wildfire. What happened up there? Do you think the captain's hurt? No, he asked for a pilot. Maybe the co-pilot's sick? He said combat pilot. Why combat? Some passengers grew restless, shifting in their seats. A man in row 22 rang his call button repeatedly, demanding answers. A woman clutched her child tighter, whispering reassurances she barely believed. Herself, the mood of the plane had shifted dramatically. The once tranquil flight now carried the sharp tang of fear. In row 10, the woman sat straighter, her senses sharpened. Years of military service had trained her to read a room, to feel tension before others even recognized it. And now, she felt it rising like a tide. She watched as two attendants hurried. Past again, one of them carrying a defibrillator kit. Her heart clenched. There was no mistaking what that meant. Someone's life, perhaps the co-pilot's, was hanging by a thread. The businessman beside her broke the silence, his voice low but shaky. This isn't good. Something's seriously wrong. She nodded faintly, but said nothing. Her mind raced. She wanted to deny it, to remain the quiet passenger she appeared to be, but denial didn't erase reality. The captain's plea replayed in her head, heavy and insistent. Any combat pilots on board? Inside the cockpit, the captain fought to maintain composure. Alarms blinked intermittently, systems demanding attention. His hands moved mechanically, adjusting throttle, recalibrating autopilot, cross-checking navigation. But he couldn't escape the awareness that he was doing this alone. The empty seat beside him was a void, a reminder of vulnerability. Commercial jets weren't meant to be flown by one person across an ocean. Every procedure, every landing, every emergency drill relied on two pilots sharing responsibility, backing each other up. Without that, even small mistakes could snowball into disaster. He spoke into the radio again, his voice tighter this time. Control, I need immediate advisement. This flight cannot continue safely without assistance. Understood, flight 248. Options are limited. You are over the Atlantic. Diverting to nearest possible runway is in progress. Please confirm fuel levels and passenger status. The captain rattled off numbers, his tone clipped, professional. But beneath the words was a growing edge of desperation. He knew what he had to do. He had to find help. And that's when he repeated it again over the intercom, his voice carrying down the length of the cabin, rattling the fragile calm. Any combat pilots on board, please come forward. The silence after the announcement was deafening. In the cabin, no one moved. Eyes darted nervously, searching for anyone who might answer the call. Passengers looked at each other as if hoping their neighbor might miraculously be a fighter pilot in disguise. But row after row remained frozen. The woman in row 10 felt the weight of every eye, even though no one looked directly at her. She could almost hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She shifted slightly, as if testing the strength of her legs, as if rehearsing the moment she knew was coming. Her mind churned. She remembered her first solo flight, the exhilaration of rising into the sky alone. She remembered combat drills, the way her instructors barked commands, demanding focus under pressure. She remembered missions that tested every ounce of courage she had. She had survived them all. But this was different. This wasn't her unit, her comrades. These were strangers, families, children. And yet, the principle was the same. When someone calls for help, you answer. Still, she hesitated. Not because she doubted her skills, but because stepping forward meant pulling the past out of the shadows. It meant admitting who she was, what she had been. For years, she had lived quietly, content to let her days unfold in the safety of normalcy. But the captain's voice had cracked that facade, demanding she remember what she had once sworn. never to forget. The businessman glanced at her, sensing something in her posture, but said nothing. She clenched her fists in her lap. Her training told her there wasn't time for doubt. Her instincts told her the captain was running out of options. The silence from the rest of the cabin told her what she already knew. No one else was coming. The crisis had found her. In the cockpit, the captain glanced again at the empty seat. His chest tightened as fatigue pressed harder on him. He prayed silently that his call had reached the right ears. Somewhere among those passengers, he hoped, was someone who could help him land this plane. And in row 10, a woman who had once flown combat missions took a slow, steadying breath. Her moment was coming. For what felt like an eternity, the cabin remained frozen. The captain's words still hung in the air, vibrating with urgency. Any combat pilots on board, please come forward. Silence followed, stretching so long that even the engine's steady drone seemed louder, pressing into every passenger's ears. No one moved. People glanced around, their eyes restless, searching desperately for a savior. A man in a sports jacket craned his neck, scanning the rows. A teenager muttered, "What the hell does he mean? Combat pilot?" A mother clutched her child tighter, whispering that everything would be fine, though her trembling hands betrayed her. The cabin air felt heavier now, thick with dread and unspoken questions. And in row 10, the woman sat rigid, her heart pounding like war drums. Every instinct screamed at her to stand, to rise, to answer. She had heard that tone of command before, the kind of tone that only surfaced when the situation had shifted from difficult to dire. She knew what it meant. The captain couldn't handle this alone. Something had happened, something far worse than turbulence or routine technical trouble. Her fingers tightened on the armrest until her knuckles paled. She told herself to wait, to breathe, to give someone else the chance. Maybe there was another pilot on board, someone younger, someone more current, someone who hadn't left the cockpit years ago. But the silence stretched on. Row after row remained motionless, eyes darting nervously, but no one daring to speak. A young man in the back raised his hand tentatively, admitting he'd flown gliders as a hobby, but his voice faltered, and he sank back into his seat when the attendant shook her head with a polite but firm, "Not enough experience." The murmurs grew louder, edged with panic. The businessman beside her exhaled sharply. "This is insane," he muttered. "They can't be serious." His eyes flicked toward her unconsciously, as though sensing her tension. But he looked away quickly, dismissing the thought. To him, she was just a tired woman in a leather jacket, an ordinary traveler like everyone else. If only that were true. She closed her eyes briefly, and memories surged like a flood. The heat of desert runways, the roar of engines at takeoff, the vibration of her fighter jet as it tore through the sky, the voices of her squadron crackling in her headset, the split-second decisions that carried lives in their balance. She had been trained for this, trained to fly under pressure, trained to steady her nerves when others lost theirs. But that was another life, a life she had walked away from. She had promised herself she wouldn't go back. The missions had taken their toll, friends lost, nights haunted by things she couldn't unsee. She had found peace in civilian life, a quiet existence where she could breathe without the weight of command pressing on her shoulders. She had convinced herself the chapter was closed. And yet, here it was again, pounding on her door 35,000 feet above the Atlantic. She opened her eyes. The passengers' murmurs were louder now. Fear vibrated through the rows, feeding on itself. A woman clutched her rosary beads, lips moving silently in prayer. Two teenagers whispered nervously, their bravado fading. A man argued with a flight attendant, demanding answers she couldn't give. The situation was unraveling. Finally, she exhaled a long, steady breath. She had waited long enough. The silence wasn't going to end itself. Her voice came quietly at first, almost lost in the noise. "I've flown before." The businessman beside her frowned, turning to look at her. "What?" She straightened, her gaze firm now. Her voice rose clearer this time, cutting through the din. "I've flown combat jets, military service." The words seemed to hang in the air like a flare in the dark. Conversations halted. Heads turned sharply, eyes locking on her. A stunned hush fell over the rows nearest to her. The businessman's mouth dropped slightly, his skepticism fighting with relief. You're a pilot?" She nodded once, her jaw set. "I was." The reaction rippled outward. Some passengers gasped audibly. Others whispered, hope flickering in their voices. "She can fly? Did you hear that?" "She said she's a pilot." A few stared at her with disbelief, as though unable to reconcile the image of the quiet woman in jeans and sneakers with the word combat. One of the flight attendants hurried over, her face lighting with urgent relief. "Ma'am," she said quickly, "did you say you've flown combat aircraft?" The woman hesitated only a second before answering. "Yes, fighter jets. I was military." The attendant's hand shook slightly as she pressed her intercom, her voice sharp with excitement. "Captain, we may have someone row 10, aisle seat." A murmur surged through the cabin, louder now, filled with energy that teetered between hope and disbelief. The young couple across the aisle leaned forward, their eyes wide. The elderly knitter lowered her needles, whispering, "Thank God." The mother with the child kissed her son's forehead, clinging to the idea that salvation might have just stood up. The woman rose from her seat, the blanket sliding from her lap. Her legs felt heavy, as if every step carried the weight of all those eyes. She could feel the pressure building with each movement, hundreds of lives depending on her. Strangers who suddenly saw her not as another passenger, but as their only chance. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. This wasn't about her past or her promises to leave it behind. This was about the now, the crisis that demanded action. And action was the only language she had ever truly known. The businessman leaned back, shaking his head in awe. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered under his breath. The flight attendant gestured urgently toward the front. "Please, follow me." As she walked down the aisle, passengers leaned. A way to give her space, their faces a mix of fear, relief, and reverence. Some whispered blessings, others simply stared. To them, she was already transformed from anonymity into something extraordinary, the woman who might save them all. Her heart thudded with adrenaline, her palms damp with sweat. She forced her breathing steady. It had been years since she'd set foot in a cockpit, years since she'd touched the controls of a machine built for the sky. Would her instincts still hold? Would the years away dull her edge? But there was no room for doubt now. The cockpit door loomed ahead, sealed and imposing. Beyond it, the captain waited, struggling alone. Beyond it, the fate of the flight trembled in uncertainty. She paused for half a second, her hand brushing the doorframe, grounding herself. Then she squared her shoulders and stepped forward. The woman from row 10, the quiet traveler who had been invisible just hours earlier, was about to become something else entirely. Not just a passenger, not just a memory of what she once was, but the answer to the captain's desperate call. The cockpit door clicked shut behind her with a metallic finality, sealing her off from the hundreds of anxious eyes in the cabin. For a heartbeat, the narrow space pressed in on her, thick with the scent of oxygen masks, heated electronics, and the faint sharpness of sweat. The hum of the engines was louder here, vibrating through the panels, alive with both power and danger. She froze for half a second, letting her eyes adjust to the dim glow of screens and blinking lights. And then she saw the captain hunched at the controls, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the yoke with desperate precision. His shirt was damp with sweat, his face pale under the harsh green light of the instruments. And beside him, on the floor, lay the co-pilot. The body was twisted awkwardly in the cramped space, an oxygen mask pressed uselessly over his face. His chest didn't rise. The medical kit lay open, defibrillator pads discarded in defeat. The stillness was unmistakable, final. Her stomach clenched at the sight, but she tore her gaze away, forcing her focus upward. There wasn't time for grief, not now. The captain's eyes flicked toward her, filled with both exhaustion and something else, hope. "You're the one?" he asked, his voice strained but steady. She nodded, sliding into the co-pilot's seat. Her hands trembled as they brushed the armrests, the faint grooves of years of use. This wasn't the narrow, stripped-down cockpit of a fighter jet. It was larger, heavier, cluttered with unfamiliar systems. But beneath the layers of technology, she recognized the bones. A machine was a machine. Flight was flight. "It's been years," she admitted, strapping herself in, tightening the harness across her chest. "But I've flown combat." The captain let out a breath that was almost a laugh, a release of tension he'd been holding far too long. "Good. I don't care if it's been decades right now. I need hands that know what they're doing." She studied the controls, eyes darting across the panels, absorbing what she could. The layout was different, the systems more complex, but the essence was familiar. Throttle, yoke, rudder pedals. Her muscles remembered, even if her mind protested. The years melted slightly as she wrapped her fingers around the yoke, feeling the vibration of an aircraft in motion. It wasn't her jet, but it was still a bird in the sky, and birds always obeyed the same truths. "What's the status?" she asked, her voice calmer than she felt. The captain's relief deepened. He rattled off the details quickly, like a man who'd been carrying the weight of the world and had finally found someone to share it with. Co-pilot collapsed an hour ago. No response. Medical team tried everything, he's gone. I've been flying solo since. We're over the Atlantic, about 90 minutes from nearest diversion. Weather's holding for now, but I'm running on fumes here. I need another set of eyes, another pair of hands. She nodded sharply. "I've got you." It was automatic, the way the words left her mouth. She had said them countless times before to her wingmen, her squadron, her commanders. A promise, a bond. And even now, years later, the weight of those words steadied her. Her hands moved almost instinctively, running through checks, confirming gauges, scanning horizon lines. The familiarity of procedure was a lifeline, pulling her out of hesitation and into clarity. She might not know every button in this cockpit, but she knew the language. A flight. The captain glanced at her again, his shoulders easing slightly, for the first time since the nightmare began. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then answered quietly. "Call me Roten for now." A faint smile tugged at his lips, despite the gravity of the moment. He didn't press. He didn't need her history. He just needed her hands steady on the controls. Back in the cabin, passengers shifted uneasily, watching the door that had swallowed her. To them, it was a portal into mystery. They didn't know what was happening on the other side, only that their fate was sealed within it. Whispers traveled down the aisles. "Do you think she can do it?" She looked confident. She looked terrified. No, she looked like she knew exactly what she was doing. The businessman from row 10 leaned forward, rubbing his temples. "She's not just some random passenger," he murmured to no one in particular. I could see it in her eyes. "She's done this before." The murmurs quieted slightly, hope threading through the fear. For the first time since the announcement, passengers began to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone was in control again. In the cockpit, control was exactly what she was reclaiming. Her eyes scanned the panels, her mind filing away the essentials. Altitude steady, fuel levels sufficient, weather clear ahead. But turbulence flickered across the radar, patches of instability waiting like traps in the dark. She adjusted the yoke gently, testing the response. It was heavier than the jets she once flew, but smoother, more forgiving. Still, she knew the danger. Big planes had big inertia. One mistake would take longer to correct. The captain's voice broke her focus. "You good?" She nodded firmly, though her pulse still thundered in her ears. "I'll adapt." "You'll have to. It's not a fighter jet." Her lips quirked into the ghost of a smile. "I'll try not to roll it then." For the first time, a genuine chuckle escaped the captain, brief but grounding. In that small moment, they were no longer strangers but a team, bound by necessity and trust. She adjusted her headset as the radio crackled with a new message from air traffic control. "Flight 248, confirm. Do you have assistance?" The captain glanced at her, then pressed the button. "Affirmative. I've got temporary reinforcement." There was a pause, static hissing. Then, "Copy. 248. Continue course. You are cleared for priority landing when able. Maintain current heading." Her stomach tightened. Priority landing. That was both a blessing and a curse. It meant the runway would be clear, yes, but it also meant ground crews were already preparing for the worst. Fire trucks, ambulances, lights blazing. It was an image she had seen too many times from above. But she shoved the thought aside. Focus, one step at a time. Her hand brushed the throttle, and she felt the hum of the engines vibrate up her arm. Something within her stirred a forgotten rhythm, a buried instinct. She was back where she belonged, even if only for this moment. The captain leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for a second, as if granting himself the smallest reprieve. "Thank you," he said quietly. She didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, steadying the plane as turbulence rattled them slightly. Her voice came low, resolute. "We're not on the ground yet. Don't thank me until then." Outside the cockpit, the sky stretched infinite and dark, the Atlantic a shadow below. Stars burned like watchful eyes, silent witnesses to the drama unfolding in the fragile bubble of metal and light that carried hundreds of lives. And in that fragile bubble, a woman who had once sworn she was done with flying was back at the controls, her past colliding with her present in the most unforgiving of ways. She had stepped into the cockpit not as a passenger, not as a bystander, but as what she had always been deep down, a pilot. The fight to bring them all home had just begun. The first shudder hit without warning. A sharp lurch to the left, a groan through the fuselage, and the cabin behind them erupted in gasps and muffled cries. Coffee cups tumbled, seatbelts snapped tight against chests, and overhead bins rattled like loose drums. Her hands tightened instinctively on the yoke, body leaning into the movement, as though muscle memory alone could will the aircraft steady. This wasn't the agile pitch of a fighter jet responding to split-second maneuvers. This was a giant bird, heavy and deliberate, its every movement delayed like an echo. "Turbulence," the captain muttered through clenched teeth. His jaw worked as he scanned the radar. "It's going to get worse before it gets better." "I've seen worse," she said automatically, her voice cool but her heart hammering. She wasn't lying. She had flown through storms that chewed up lesser pilots. She had cut through hostile skies with enemy fire streaking the night. But this was different. In those missions, the risk was hers to bear. Here, hundreds of lives pressed invisibly against her shoulders. The yoke jerked again, harder this time, and alarms chimed angrily on the console. She steadied her breathing, letting her mind narrow the chaos into sequence. Horizon, altitude, throttle, correction. The basics. Always the basics. Behind her, the intercom clicked. A flight attendant's voice trembled, just audible over the roar. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Everything is under control. The words were practiced, calm, but she could imagine the wide eyes, the white knuckles gripping armrests. Fear traveled faster. Then sound on a plane. The captain's hand brushed the panel, switching frequencies. A burst of static, then the clipped tone of air traffic control. Flight 248, report status. The captain glanced at her before responding. Experiencing severe turbulence, moderate control issues, co-pilot incapacitated. Temporary assistance. At controls. The line went silent for a moment, then returned with brisk professionalism. Copy that. 248. Maintain heading 082. Weather pattern shifting, advise course. Correction 3 degrees north to avoid secondary system. Confirm capability. She leaned closer to the captain, studying the radar display. Clouds, jagged with red, sprawled across their path like a wall. 3 degrees wasn't much, but it could be the difference between manageable turbulence and a storm that could tear them apart. Confirm, she said, before the captain could answer. Her hand adjusted the yoke with a precision born from long nights in cockpits half this size. The aircraft responded sluggishly, but obeyed, sliding onto the new course. The radio crackled again. 248. You are cleared priority. Ground crews standing by. Her gut twisted. Standing by. She knew what that meant. Flashing lights, emergency vehicles waiting, runways cleared not for convenience, but for catastrophe. Somewhere down below, strangers already assumed the worst. The turbulence thickened, throwing the plane like a toy on unseen currents. The cabin groaned. Somewhere behind them, a child wailed, a sound that cut sharper than any alarm. Her grip tightened. Her voice, however, stayed level. Pitch 2 degrees down. We'll ride it out smoother here. The captain followed her lead, adjusting controls. His glance toward her carried something new now, not just relief, but respect. She wasn't just keeping the bird steady. She was flying. You've done this before, he said under his breath, almost to himself. She didn't answer. She couldn't afford to peel back the layers of memory that threatened to rise nights lit with tracer fire, the roar of engines that once felt like an extension of her body. She had buried that part of her life years ago. But tonight, the skies had dragged it back, demanded it. Minutes stretched like hours. Every bump, every sway became a test of endurance, not just for the aircraft, but for the people inside it. In row 10, her former seat, the businessman gripped his armrest so tightly his knuckles gleamed white. The elderly woman beside him whispered prayers under her breath, a steady rhythm that seemed to calm those nearby. A mother clutched her child, rocking slightly in a desperate imitation of normalcy. They didn't know her name. They didn't know her past. But they whispered about her like she was already legend. The woman in row 10, she's in the cockpit now. She's the reason we're still in the air. The words traveled. In low murmurs, binding strangers with fragile hope. Inside the cockpit, sweat dripped down her temple, but her mind was cold, clear. She worked in tandem with the captain, each command short, precise. Throttle steady. Level correction now. Bank left 3 degrees. The plane responded, groaning but compliant, like a massive animal that understood it was finally under a firm hand. Her headset crackled again. 248, turbulence ahead for 20 more miles. Hold course. After that, clear skies until London. 20 more miles. At this speed, that meant 20 eternal minutes of shaking, rattling, testing every nerve they had left. The captain glanced sideways. You ready?" She inhaled deeply, her grip steadying. Always. The worst of it hit like a wave. The plane dipped violently, a stomach-dropping plunge that sent trays and cups flying in the cabin. Screams pierced the air, sharp and terrified. The overhead lights flickered, then steadied. Her entire body reacted, instincts firing faster than thought. She pulled back gently, not fighting the turbulence, but guiding through it, like surfing. Waves instead of trying to conquer them. Her voice, low and even, filled the small space. "Ride with it, don't fight it. We'll break through." The captain followed her lead, matching her adjustments. For a moment, it was as though they shared one mind, two hands moving as one. The plane steadied. Not completely, never completely, but enough. Enough to quiet the screams, to smooth the violent jolts into something survivable. Behind them, the cabin slowly fell into a tense silence, the kind of silence that came when fear loosened just enough to allow breath. Her arms ached, her shoulders burned, but she didn't let go. She couldn't, not until they were free. Minutes dragged, 5, 10, 15, and then like a curtain lifting, the radar cleared. The storm faded behind them, leaving only calm skies ahead. The captain exhaled so hard it was almost a sob. He leaned back, scrubbing a hand down his face. "We made it." She didn't relax. Not yet. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, her hands still steady on the controls. "We're not down yet," she said, her voice hard but quiet. "The hardest part still to come." He nodded, sobered instantly. Because she was right. Turbulence was survivable. The landing would decide everything. And as London lights began to twinkle faintly on the distant edge of the dark horizon, the woman in row 10 prepared herself for the most dangerous minutes of all. The city lights glittered on the horizon, faint pinpricks against the deep velvet of night. For hours, the ocean had stretched beneath them vast, black, merciless. Now, at last, there was land. But for the woman in row 10, now seated firmly in the cockpit, relief was not an option. The hardest test lay directly ahead. Her eyes swept the dashboard, scanning every dial, every glowing number. Fuel levels, altitude, wind speed, runway approach coordinates blinking on the navigation screen. The systems looked reassuring to the untrained eye, but she could see the strain. The storm had pushed them off balance. The aircraft had taken punishment. Bringing it safely to the ground would be no smooth routine. The captain's voice, quieter now, broke her concentration. "Runway 27L Heathrow. Emergency crews already mobilized. Emergency crews. Fire engines. Ambulances. Floodlights waiting like silent sentinels." She had landed on air bases with sirens blaring, medics on standby, and commanding officers barking. Orders. This was different. This was a city. Civilians. Families. Innocent people who didn't even know how close disaster hovered. She nodded, jaw tight. "We'll get them down." Behind the cockpit door, the atmosphere inside the cabin thickened like fog. Passengers had stopped whispering. Many simply sat in silence, eyes closed, lips moving in prayer. A businessman pressed his forehead to the seat in front of him, whispering to himself. A mother clutched her child so tightly, the girl's small hands pressed pale against her chest. And in row 10, the now empty row, where she had once been, lay a blanket crumpled on the seat. Some passengers glanced toward it again and again, as if expecting her to return, as if she were some ghostly protector whose very presence kept the plane aloft. "Flaps to 30, she instructed, her voice firm, crisp. The captain obeyed. For the last hour, their teamwork had grown seamless. He trusted her now not just as a stand-in co-pilot, but as someone who could carry the weight with him. Her breathing slowed, syncing with the rhythm of the engines. She could feel the jet responding under her touch, sluggish but alive, like a beast exhausted yet determined to finish the run. Altitude steady at 2,000, the captain reported. She adjusted, the plane dipping slightly as the runway lights appeared below two glowing strips of safety, framed by the glittering city beyond. It looked impossibly small, impossibly far. Yet it was all they had. Air traffic control's voice filled her headset, calm and practiced. Flight 248, you are cleared priority landing on 27L Winds Cross at 10 knots, visibility moderate. Emergency cruise in position. Godspeed. She swallowed. Godspeed. The word clung to her more than the data. Not because of faith, but because of finality. Copy that, she replied, her tone even. The descent began. Every second stretched into an eternity. The nose dipped, the horizon tilted, and the lights of London swelled to fill the windows. The cabin trembled with each adjustment, and somewhere behind them, someone screamed short. Sharp, then silenced as others shushed, desperate not to break the fragile calm. Her hands moved with precision, easing the yoke, feathering the throttle. Fighter jets had been instinctive, fluid-like dancing with a blade in the sky. But this was different. This was lumbering weight, momentum that refused to be tamed. Yet she adapted, adjusting not with force, but with patience. 500 feet, the captain said, voice taut. The ground rushed upward. Steady, she whispered. Not to him. Not to the plane, to herself. The runway loomed larger, a glowing path in the night. Her muscles ached, her palms slick against the controls. She forced herself not to overthink, not to remember the people packed into the cabin behind her, not to imagine the flames waiting if she failed. She locked herself into the moment, into the craft, into the math of angles and speed. 300 feet, the captain announced. The plane jolted slightly, a side gust pushing them off course. She corrected immediately, jaw clenching. 200. The engines roared lower, flaps fully extended. 100. Her breath slowed, every nerve sharpened. She tightened her grip, her voice low and steady. Hold. The landing gear screamed against the tarmac, a violent, bone-deep shudder rattling through the plane. The sound was deafening, like thunder breaking the earth. The cabin erupted with gasps and cries. For a heartbeat, the aircraft teetered, half ready to skid sideways. Her hands moved faster than thought, correcting, pressing, guiding. The nose dipped, the rear jolted, and then miraculously, the wheels aligned. The runway rushed beneath them, lights blurring into streaks. The brakes fought gravity, shrieking. Her body braced against the force, teeth gritted, arms burning as the aircraft slowed, and then silence. Not true silence, of course, the hiss of brakes, the hum of engines, the muted sobs from the cabin, but silence in the way only survivors know. A silence where breath finally returns, where hearts remember to beat again. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, from the cabin, came the first sound, a single clap, hesitant, unsure. Another followed, then another. Within seconds, the plane thundered with applause, with cheers, with cries of relief. Strangers embraced, tears streaming freely. The businessman wept openly into his hands. The mother kissed her child again and again. Prayers of thanks filled the air. And yet, in the cockpit, she remained still. Her hands hovered above the controls, trembling slightly now that the fight was over. Her chest heaved with breaths she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The captain turned to her, eyes shining. He wanted to say something, thank you, perhaps, or you saved us, but words failed. Instead, he simply reached out and gripped her arm with quiet strength. She met. His gaze gave a single nod, then finally exhaled. Outside, blue and red lights flashed against the windows as emergency vehicles raced alongside them. Fire trucks, ambulances, rescue crews. They slowed with the aircraft, surrounding it like guardians. The radio buzzed. Flight 248. Welcome. To Heathrow. Passengers safe. Crew safe. Outstanding work. Outstanding work. The words barely touched her. She wasn't thinking about praise. She wasn't thinking about heroism. She was only thinking that the wheels had touched ground, that lives had been spared, and that for tonight, at least the sky had let them go. As the plane taxied toward the terminal, the applause continued, rippling like a wave through the cabin. People craned to see the cockpit, to catch a glimpse of the woman they now spoke of in awe. The mysterious stranger from row 10 who had become their savior. But she didn't open the door. Not yet. She sat quietly, staring out the windshield at the floodlit runway ahead. For once, she allowed herself a moment not of pride, but of release. She had carried them through the storm. She had brought them down safely. That was enough. And in row 10, her abandoned blanket still lay waiting, a silent reminder of where it all began. Tomorrow, the story would spread through the passengers, the crew, the news. But for tonight, only those aboard truly understood the miracle that had unfolded in the skies above. The miracle led by the quiet woman who had once been just another traveler, asleep in row 10. The jet finally rolled to a complete stop. Engines wound down with a hollow whine, echoing like a sigh after hours of tension. Outside the windows, emergency crews clustered, lights flashing in strobes of red and blue. The runway was alive with movement firefighters gripping hoses, paramedics ready with stretchers, police officers clearing space. It was a scene of preparation for disaster, though disaster had been narrowly avoided. Inside, the cabin erupted in a new wave of applause. Louder this time, raw with gratitude. Passengers cheered as if they'd landed on solid ground after weeks at sea. Strangers hugged, tears streaked down faces, and laughter broke out between sobs. It was chaos, but the chaos of joy. Yet in the cockpit, she sat still. Her hands finally released the controls, fingers stiff, her arms trembling with exhaustion. She let herself lean back against the seat, the leather cool against her skin. For the first time since leaving row 10, she let her eyes close. Not long, just a heartbeat, but long enough to feel the weight of what had passed. The captain placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it." His voice carried the huskiness of a man who had come too close to the edge. She opened her eyes slowly. "We did it," she corrected. He nodded, though his gaze lingered on her with a respect deeper than words. When the cockpit door finally opened, a flood of light and noise poured in. Flight attendants stepped in. First, their eyes brimming with tears. They wanted to hug her, to thank her, to pull her into the cabin where applause still thundered. But she shook her head slightly. "Not now. Take care of them," she said simply, gesturing to the passengers. The attendants nodded, understanding more than her words revealed. Passengers began filing out, row by row, their relief palpable. Many glanced toward the cockpit, craning their necks for a glimpse of their savior. Some whispered, was it true? Was she really a pilot? Others swore they'd seen her walk down the aisle earlier, that she was the one who had answered the captain's desperate call. But none could prove it, not yet. In row 10, the crumpled blanket lay like an unanswered question. A seat was empty, yet full of meaning. For many, it would become a story in itself, the ordinary seat that hid an extraordinary person. At the terminal, the chaos only grew. News had already spread Heathrow, had been alerted of the emergency, and word leaked to journalists. Cameras flashed, microphones waved, and reporters shouted questions. Who saved the plane? Was it the captain alone? Rumor says. Passenger landed it? Can you confirm? The passengers, dazed and emotional, spilled out into the terminal. Some spoke eagerly, telling and retelling the story with embellishments already taking root. Others shook their heads, still too overwhelmed to speak. And somewhere among them, whispers grew louder. The woman. Row 10. She was the one, but the woman herself did not walk among them. While passengers were escorted out, she slipped quietly down a service corridor, guided by a discreet crew member who understood. She didn't want the cameras. She didn't want the spotlight. She had stepped forward only because no one else could. To her, that wasn't heroism, it was duty. Her boots echoed softly against the polished floor as she moved through the quieter passages of Heathrow, avoiding the flood of journalists gathering by the main exit. Her body still carried the tension of the flight, every muscle stiff, but she walked with quiet purpose. In a small waiting lounge reserved for crew, she paused. A mirror hung on the wall, and for a moment she studied her reflection. She looked ordinary again. No flight suit, no medals, no rank insignia. Just a traveler in jeans, sneakers, and a leather jacket worn at the elbows. No one would know by looking at her what she had done. No one would guess that she had once flown combat missions in the world's most advanced jets, or that tonight hundreds of lives had rested in her hands. She liked it that way. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her boarding pass. Row 10. A simple seat number that would now live in the memories of strangers as part of their survival story. She tucked it away again, smiling faintly. By the time she finally stepped out into the cool London night, the terminal was still buzzing with reporters. Floodlights illuminated the glass walls, cameras rolling live broadcasts. She avoided them easily, slipping into the shadows, vanishing among the flow of travelers. Outside, taxis honked, buses idled, and the city pulsed with its usual rhythm indifferent to the miracle that had just occurred above its skies. She breathed deeply, letting the crisp air wash away the scent of aviation fuel and recycled cabin air. Her heartbeat slowed. The night was calm now. In the days to come, the story would spread. Passengers would tell their families. Then the media. Each retelling would shift slightly, details blurred or exaggerated. Some would say the captain alone saved them. Others would swear it was the mysterious woman in row 10. Rumors would swirl, interviews would air, and debates would rage. But she would not appear on any screen. She would not give any statement. To the world, she would remain a rumor, a legend, a faceless savior, and she preferred it that way. For her, heroism was never about applause. It was about moments like tonight, when action mattered more than recognition, when lives depended on doing what was right. She walked away from Heathrow, not as a hero, not as a headline, but simply as herself. A woman carrying memories too heavy for most to understand, and a past that refused to let her go entirely. Weeks later, some passengers would meet for reunions, bonded forever by that night. They would share their versions of the story, laugh about their fear, cry about their gratitude. And inevitably, someone would ask, "Do you remember her? The woman in row 10? And the others would nod. They would. Never forget. Somewhere far from the city, the woman herself would sit quietly by a window, a cup of coffee in her hands, watching the sunrise. She wouldn't need the recognition, the thanks, or the stories. Knowing they were alive was enough. For the rest of her life, she would carry the silence of that night, the hum of the engines, the cries of the passengers, the weight of the yoke in her hands, and the moment the wheels finally kissed the runway. It was her story, yes, but it also belonged to everyone who had lived it. And though the world might never know her name, she would always be remembered by those who mattered most. the quiet hero of row 10.